You, Xenia, so much for joining me today, even via Zoom. You've written a really fascinating paper. I was wondering if you could just sort of tell us a little bit about the motivations behind the research. What were the things you were interested in and the sort of the topics you wanted to delve into?
Well, thank you, Joe, for having me. And it is a shame that we are not meeting in person, but it is what it is right now. So this paper investigates the effects of a political conflict on women's economic empowerment. And in general, economists have long been interested in the effects of conflicts on development and labor market outcomes. And so, for example, conflicts such as the First World War or the Second World War have been really extensively studied. And they're still at the center of attention as we see, this machine learning and also big data analysis that they allow construction of novel detailed data sets to kind of dive into them in more detail. And so a common theme in the study of such conflicts is that historical shocks affect sex ratios. And then this is basically via shortage of men, right? And then this affects female labor force participation positively as men, basically go out of the labor markets. And then we see that women kind of replace them in the labor markets, at least in the shorter run. And so there's this growing literature that studies the effects of such demographic shocks, but more through the investigation of social and cultural norms. And so this is basically how I also started. I was thinking about how this big change in the labor markets, which was the entrance of females in the markets, how did this start, and how basically what was the event that affected such a big this big entrance of women. And so I'm studying political conflicts because it's much less known how these conflicts, and by political conflicts I mean violent ideological conflicts such as civil wars, how do these affect and what's their role on gender-specific labor market outcomes. And Greece, in my case, provides an excellent example of such a conflict, because the Greek civil war that happened like right after the Second World War was the result of a political conflict struggle between conservative supporters of the monarchy and left-wing supporters of the communists.
It would be actually really interesting for me and possibly for some of our viewers as well, if you could set the scene a little bit about this. It's a very sort of specific historical and socioeconomic context.
Yeah, and also I'm not also sure how much people know about this specific conflict. Of course, they know about the Second World War, but not as much as this specific conflict. So that would be nice. So let me start from a bit even earlier. So in 1939, when it was about the beginning of the Second World War, Greece was under monarchy, but with authoritarian government. And so Greece aimed for neutrality in the Second World War because of the devastating results of the First World War that participated in. But still they had close relations with Britain. But in October 28th, which is actually, this Ohi day for Greece, this no day for Greece, Greece entered the war because they refused the intervention from the Italians. And so the entrance of the Italians in the country to occupy it. And so that's how Greece entered the Second World War. And then the royal family at the time, as we said, we had a king, they self-exiled to Egypt, but there was strong resistance movement that was led by the Communist Party. And so for this reason, the British troops also arrived for help. And there was such a pressure, so the resistance movement was so big that the pressure of the occupation was quite large, as we had 3 occupational zones. We didn't only have Italians, but we also had German occupation zone and a Bulgarian occupation zone. And so, so we kind of understand the pressure during the Second World War. And then in 1944, when the Axis alliance was defeated and then the war was over, there was this question of what are we going to do then afterwards? Who is going to rule now the country? And so there was also this question of the return of the king to be in power. And this caused quite some violence. Since the communists at the time, during the Second World War, the communists fought. And so they felt kind of entitled to some part, at least, of the government. But as we understand, monarchy and communism, they don't really go together. So it's not like there could be some kind of political compromise. And so there was this referendum on September 1st of 1946 regarding the return of the king. And this referendum was kind of this starting point of the civil war, because monarchy was restored as the result of the referendum. And so the civil war began. And then we see this crucial national political division between left-wing supporters of the communists, so including communists, against the conservative supporters of the monarchy. And during this time, during this, and in some areas, yes, but overall, no. It was around 70% of the population that voted for the return of the king. Yes. So this is basically what happened and what I'm studying right now. And so how this civil war affected female labor force participation.
Okay, it sounds like a very interesting sort of and specific and very, in some ways, historically contingent period to look at. And there's a lot of different sort of specific factors and specific characteristics of this period. Are there any of those in particular that you want to sort of, that you've tried to focus on, or that you've tried to reflect in your research?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. What I would really like to emphasize is that before this war, basically, like based on election data from previous periods in Greece and so on, we kind of have this, again, we had some kind of a division, political division, but it was more like conservatives versus Republicans. So like Greeks, kind of tended to be attached to a personality. And so they were kind of following this personality, but as a political, ideology, they were basically all conservatives before. And then suddenly, like more or less, it was around 5% of the overall share of the election results that they were distributed to the communist, for example, party. But then we kind of see this increase in political ideologies shifted towards communism because of this resistance movement, because of the support of the communists during this difficult time. And so I find this very kind of important to mention, that before that, we don't really see this rise of communism. And then afterwards, we kind of see not necessarily that people become communists, but it's more people support communism.
Because of the efforts of the communists during the war.
Because of the, exactly, yes, because of this efforts, and how, because there was famine during, there are terrible things happening during wars. And so this support, and they also created some kind of administration units to be very well organized during this resistance and not leave any areas behind. And so I think this kind of reflects in the support of the public that they got during the war, and then also that kind of remained afterwards. And there is this paper by Lebas that I'm quite using, that she basically claims that there are two conditions in order for political polarization, which that's how basically I think about this, because we see that we had like kind of monarchy supporters, and then there is this increased opposition to this belief. And so there is also kind of increased polarization in a sense. And so Lebas argues that there are two conditions for polarization to have positive effects. And I think Greece kind of ticks both of the boxes. So one is that we need two forces that they're going to be kind of equally, like even among each other. And then in this case, we kind of have this equal, more or less equal support. And also no pre-existing, identity representation and identity differences before political polarization. And so Greece at the time was fairly homogeneous in a sense of identity and in a sense of religion, which was part of the identity at the time, at least.
I mean, that's one of the things, I think a lot of Western European countries following the end of the war moved in some sense to the social democratic or the socialist, or in some sense the communist left, because these political groups were seen to have played a part in sort of resisting Nazism. But of course, very few places, right, had a monarchy referendum so soon afterwards. So it's an interesting mechanism to look at. And I'd actually like to take this moment to ask you a little bit about the method and the methodology in the paper and these kind of aspects.
I think I will start with the data, if that's all right, a little bit,
Yeah,
just to explain the years and everything. So in my main analysis, I study female labor force participation at the province level. And just to understand the administration unit here, so in 1920, Greece has 9 regions that include 35 departments. And this consists of 139 provinces in total, that they're of course further, divided into municipalities and cities and so on. So I construct a data set that is based on 6 Greek historical censuses from 1920 until 1981, that they are divided roughly per 10 years or something. And they're provided by the Hellenic Statistical Authority. They're online. And to reflect changes in Greek administrative units, I use this 139 provinces as reported in 1920, because of course things have changed, they increased or decreased, merged and so on. So I link them through geographical information systems. So I use this data in order to estimate the effect of the political opposition on female labor force participation using a difference in differences model. Now, the treatment itself, so this political opposition, is the vote share in this referendum in 1946 about the return of the king. And it was right prior to the Civil War, and captures the exposure to political opposition to the conservative regime. Mm-hmm. And it continues, so it's interpreted as the potential for political polarization. So I'm using this differences in differences model. And I find that a province that is 10% more politically opposed to monarchy experiences a 1.4 percentage points increase in female labor force participation after the war. And this suggests basically that women in areas that they are more exposed to left-wing ideologies become more economically empowered. Mm-hmm. Also after the war. And I think the most interesting part is that this persists also through time. So it's not something that these effects are not really gone after some years, which was also quite surprising to me as well.
No, that's one of the things that struck me when reading the paper was the sort of the notion of persistence and the way these effects do sort of, as you say, persist across time. I'd be interested to hear sort of some of your reflections on that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the mechanisms that I'm using is persistence. So how basically political views, historical political views, as reflected by this referendum, how these correlate to current ones. So I'm using the European value study to measure political views, of course, with shorter, because they're individual level data there. So of course we have less observations in a province level. But I saw that there is a strong correlation between political views back then and political views nowadays. So we kind of see this persistence of views. And then we also see that there is this correlation also nowadays between left-wing ideologies, for example, and gender norms, more loose and relaxed gender norms also nowadays. So this persistence, it's how a war back then can actually have still effects on women's lives even nowadays, and not just women's, right? Because women are also part of communities and you know, also men's life and so on. So we kind of see this reflection also until 1981 that I'm studying, at least. So I think persistence is important. Sorry.
I think this, do you feel that this is an understudied area within the field or within the literature? Or would you like to sort of further develop some of your work in this area or apply these methods to other contexts?
I think it's not, and I wouldn't say it's understudied. There has been incredible work on especially persistence, but also gender norms and female labor force participation across different countries, and also, for example, the United States by Golden and Asamoglu and so on. But I think Greece as a region itself is quite understudied. And because I think also there was quite an importance of the specific country in the Second World War, for example, and also we see attention to the country because of the economic crisis later on, and also the entrance of the country to the European Union and all sort of things, and it is part of this European Union. So I think the region itself is quite understudied, and also the female labor force participation in Greece and the trend of that is quite understudied. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, I was wondering if there were any sort of key takeaways or key findings that you'd like to sort of stress or flag up with this work, which again I did think was a really fascinating paper.
Thank you so much. I think there are 3 key findings that they emerged from this analysis, and of course it shouldn't be completely generalized, because as we said, there should be conditions. Like Lebas said, right? No, not me. There should be some conditions in order to apply those. But so first, exposure to political opposition opens up opportunities for women towards economic empowerment under certain conditions, right? Yep. So this is one thing. Second, areas exposed to different political views and usually a bit more opposed to the current situation of each country tend to support less conservative institutions and hence relax gender norms. And third, political views, as we said, persistence is quite important. Political views persist through time. And this persistence basically means also sustaining the correlated gender norms with it. And so we should kind of not underestimate correlations as well. And we should kind of look into this more, ideas that they go from generation to generation and they stay.
The sort of inheritance
in our lives
of ideology.
Yes, exactly, this inheritance. Yeah. You said it much better than I did.
I don't think so. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and to share some of the findings from your paper. Thank you, Xenia.
Thank you for the interest. Thank you.